Hi, my name is Sanjay Nadaraja, and I work for Inglasia Pharma Solutions. I'm going to be delivering a very brief presentation on Inglasia Pharma Solutions live online good distribution practice training course that we provide to any learner anywhere in the world that wants to learn about global good distribution practices. To start with, I would always refer to the organization's quality policy. Whether you're a wholesaler, a distributor that transports medicinal products, a manufacturer, or anyone within the supply chain that's handling medicinal products or even sourcing raw materials for manufacturing of medicines, should be aware that the organization needs to have a quality focus, and everyone within the organization needs to embrace the requirements of quality and also ensure that the product integrity is maintained throughout that entire supply chain, from sourcing of the raw materials right all the way through to the manufacturing, packaging, testing, and supply of that product to the global market through wholesalers and transportation providers. And throughout this, the regulatory requirements of organizations that need to comply with the regulations of manufacturing and distribution of medicines need to adhere to those standards to maintain their license obligations. And ultimately, by achieving all this within organizations, exceptional customer services is delivered. In this course, the following topics will be covered, and this session normally is a one-day course that lasts for approximately 6 hours. The learning objectives of the course are: what is good distribution practices? What does it mean to me? It's a term that's used quite widely, and it's also referring to a set of guidelines that come from legal directives. But what does it actually mean to me? And what do the regulators say, and what do they actually want? Typically, regulators will say one thing, but the guidelines state something else. Or the guidelines state something, and the regulators want exactly that. However, within certain organizations, certain distributors in the supply chain, they just cannot meet all those expectations of the guidelines because of the nature of their business model. And we'll talk about things to consider around that to make sure that your business is fit for purpose. We'll be covering the commonalities between countries. So as we discussed, this will be a global good distribution practice training course. And we will look at some of the commonalities between countries where if you go to anywhere in the world and you're dealing with a supply chain where medicines are being moved from point A to B, what are the typical expectations within the supply chain to adhere to good distribution practices? And I'll be touching on some examples on that. How should I look after my product in the supply chain? Now, there's a whole lot of regulations out there, and your business model might be very simple or could be very complex. So what do I need to know? What information do I need to have to be able to assess what exactly I need to be fit for purpose for my business, to ensure that my business is efficient, compliant, and ensures the patient's safety? So how do I go about ensuring that my product and the patient at the end of the day is safe from the medicines that we supply to them? And the best way of achieving this is by really doing a risk assessment of your business model and applying that against the regulations and seeing where you stand and what you need to do to reduce the level of risk for your supply chain. And also, it's something to remember when you've done your risk assessment, put the measures in place to reduce the level of risk. It's an ongoing process. It's not a one solution fixes all. You got to keep doing this again and again until you reduce the level of risk by making continuous improvement and monitoring your systems that you have in place to pick up for anything that could potentially highlight any concerns, or even the concerns that are already there further reducing those to a level where you can be assured that the patient will get the medicine of the right quality, safety, and efficacy. I like to call it GDP in an onion. What is GDP? In this section, there will be quite a number of topics that I cover, but the highlights and to just summarize is that we need to know the supply chain, the suppliers that we're sourcing from. Again, it could be suppliers of your raw material, your active ingredient, right from the farm or from the abattoir where it's sourced and then extracted, purified, and then made into the drug substance that goes into your finished product, all the way through the entire supply chain, through the manufacturing facility, warehouse, into the wholesaler warehouses, and then local in-country warehouse, and to the end customer. Know your product in terms of its handling. What type of product is it? What's its stability like? Understand the science of your product. This information all really helps towards doing a very thorough and detailed risk assessment. And also have the regulatory framework in mind, know what the expectations are, to remind us if we don't already know what we need to be doing or looking at, and have that as a tool to perform your gap assessment right at the beginning before starting any risk assessment. And then you perform the risk assessment. And this is a tool that's widely being used now in the pharmaceutical industry. As the supply chain becomes more and more complex, this is becoming more and more of a need to use risk assessment tools. And it's about ensuring quality every step of the way. And how do we achieve this? Having the right quality mindset, everyone within the organization embracing quality, and understanding the need to document every step of the way as we document the actions we take within our supply chain. And data integrity is a key topic now being used within good manufacturing practices and good distribution practices. And there's an expectation to have a process there and how that goes across the organization and defined within procedures within the quality system. And ultimately, with all this knowledge and all these systems in place, we will ensure the patient safety, the product quality, and your business is successful and efficient in what it does. So what do the regulators say and what do they actually want? Some regulators have very high expectations of the pharmaceutical supply chain, and they're expecting even more. The regulations year on year are getting even more detailed. The expectations are growing. And as industry, especially the big pharma, sets greater standards, the regulators go along with those and expect even more from everyone in the supply chain. And sometimes that can be a little unrealistic if you're a small organization, perhaps dealing with one type of product, which is fairly stable type of product, maybe looking at a solid dose or a liquid or an ointment that's got preservatives, ensuring that that product is fairly stable in many adverse conditions it could potentially face. So risk assessments are a great tool to be able to justify the reasons why you do certain things in certain ways, and having that documented is something that will help any auditor or anyone looking at your quality system and your processes to understand exactly why you're doing what you're doing and accept that. Far better approach than to have nothing there to present to anyone to see your rationale for why your quality system is fit for purpose. I've seen regulatory authorities' expectations at a global level. I've been at organizations and seen how auditors have questioned and challenged certain quality systems and whether they're fit for purpose. And what I've found is that from one regulator to another, and the inspector, going specifically to the inspector, they all have their own individual preferences and areas of expertise. So one day you might get an inspector coming in and asking all questions around your temperature mapping and your temperature control and monitoring of your warehouse or your transportation vehicles. And the next day you could get another inspector coming along, not asking you any questions about that, but just focusing on your checks on your suppliers and customers, and how do you document that, and how do you ensure that you're doing the right bona fide checks, and holding the relevant documents you need. So every inspector has a different expectation. And some of them, especially the new ones that come into the industry, I find are very, very theory based. They go by what's written in the regulations and they recite it word for word and expect you to have to comply to that, even if your business doesn't really kind of fit that regulatory model that they're expecting you to be complying to. So again, assess your business against the guidelines, see whether it's fit for purpose or not in some of those areas, and adapt it accordingly so that it's making your business more efficient. And most importantly, for me, it's ensuring that it protects your product in the supply chain and ensures the patient's safety. Each have their own interpretation of the regulations. So there are certain regulatory authorities around the world that would have certain expectations. And this is because of sometimes cultural differences also play a part in how they enforce the regulations. So bear that in mind. I've seen in China, yes is not necessarily yes, it could be a no, but they always say things in certain ways that make you think that they know what you're saying, but maybe they're not quite hitting the mark. And also I've seen in the Middle East where sometimes if you're trying to make sure that you know who is going into which areas of a warehouse facility, you need to write down or keep records of who that person is so that you can track and identify if anything goes wrong. However, in the Middle East, I found that sometimes they find it's an offense to ask someone to put their name down on a sheet of paper and keep records in such a way where it's keeping someone, an individual named for a particular task or access to a certain area. And they find that quite unusual, that the GDP expectations are to ensure that you keep a log of people that come in and out of your facility, so that you can ensure that you know if anything goes wrong, that you can look at who could potentially have played a part in a failure within the warehouse or transportation of product to a customer. And this bureaucracy and bribery in the developing countries, you tend to find this more where authorities are not necessarily going by the book. Sometimes they could be expecting you to do more when you shouldn't really have to, or vice versa. And sometimes bribery does play a part in this in certain parts of the world. So your focus always has to be on, am I doing the right thing here to ensure that the patient gets the medicine of the right quality? So it's not about focusing on the regulators, it's about focusing about your supply chain, your product, and how you're going to ensure that patient safety at the end of the day. So what I'm trying to say here is, do not always do this just for the regulators. Do it for the patient in mind. It could be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be even yourself. I've always found that being pragmatic really helps, and also taking a pragmatic approach within the organization and how you do things really helps the business overall and ensures the patient safety. Sometimes when we overcook it or think too much, we can make a process overly complicated when it doesn't really need to be. Strip it back to the bare basics of what we need to be doing, keep it clear so everyone can follow it consistently and understand it, and the reasons behind it is really understood. Knowing the product again, knowing about how to handle that product in the supply chain, and knowing what your supply chain looks like, who you're sourcing from, who you're supplying to, and who's helping you to enable that in your supply chain. Having that full knowledge and documenting it. The Pharmaceutical Inspectorate Corporations are a very good organization that a number of health authorities globally have adopted, approximately 49 participating authorities. And this PICS has adopted the EU Good Distribution Practice Guidelines 2013 C 343/01 back in 2014. So what I'm trying to say here is that these countries, when you look it up on the PICS website, there are quite a few spread across the world, and they have adopted the EU GDP guidelines to ensure that when they go and inspect licensed supply chain wholesalers or even manufacturers for the provisions of storing medicines in their facility prior to shipping out to wholesalers or warehouses, have to comply to the EU GDP standards of storage and transportation of medicinal products. So bear this in mind. It's a very useful document, and it can be applied in countries across the world. So what will the inspectors expect to see? Now, here I've got a number of topics all within the EU GDP guidelines, and I've kind of picked out some key messages that we all need to be aware of, and I've summarized it in this presentation. Now, when the full training course is delivered, we go into much more detail, and we touch on each of these areas, giving some examples of where, if you didn't comply to that, where things could go wrong, and it really gives you the message very clearly with a real life example that I can share from many warehouses, transportation companies I've inspected over these number of years. So as you can see, the topics that are covered here are organization and management, personnel, quality systems, facilities, vehicles, shipping containers and labels for dispatch and receipt, goods in transit and how they should be handled, audit and self-inspections, documentation and how documents should be kept, complaints handling, how we should handle recalls, return products, how they should be processed within the warehouse, supplier customer verifications, which is quite a big topic over the recent years, counterfeits and how do we mitigate risk of that in our supply chain and what is being put in place by the industry, importation and export, and this is quite a big topic as well in terms of how do we know the type of product we're importing and exporting. Are there any restrictions on those products? And if so, how do we know what they are and how do we find out? And we're going to touch a little bit on that as well during the training course. And also contracts. What kind of contracts should we have in place within the organization? Across the world, the expectations of good distribution practices does vary. However, I've identified this document here by the World Health Organization. It's a very good document to use if you are even an auditor going and auditing anywhere in the world, any wholesale or transportation provider. And what are the key things you need to be looking for? Firstly, do they have a quality management system? And do they have someone designated to manage their quality system? It could typically be called a responsible person, a responsible pharmacist, or someone called the designated person. There needs to be a training program in place, and that needs to be effectively managed, and training records need to be in file. Risk management. As I mentioned, it's becoming more and more of a requirement, and as the supply chain gets more complex, the risk assessment is really needed to be able to streamline your business to be fit for purpose. Product segregation. Any warehouse you go to needs to have clear segregation of products in terms of what's quarantined, what's put into sale, what's returned, what's reject, and what's for recall. Going on to complaints, recalls, counterfeits, there needs to be a process there for picking up things that go wrong and documenting that immediately, because any complaint that comes in could be the trigger of something far more serious, like a recall or like a counterfeit product in your supply chain. So every complaint has to be taken seriously and acted on immediately. Returns. Now, if you send a product out, how do you know that if someone doesn't want it and they want to send it back, how do you know what you get back is of the right quality that you can reintroduce it back into the supply chain? What are the checks you're going to do? And these are things that already I've seen anywhere in the world that I've gone and audited. Wholesalers have a process in place. They might not be great, They might need improvements, but they do have something. So bear this in mind. You do need to have a process for handling returns. Temperature. Now, this is a key area. I've seen a lot of issues around this wherever I've gone. I've never found a system that I would say is pretty much perfect. And regulators equally that I've seen have had lots of issues around temperature monitoring, temperature control, and temperature mapping of facilities. Supply chain verification. Who are your suppliers? Who you're sourcing from? You need to know that all the way across the chain. And who are you selling to? And how do you do that? You need to check their licenses, make sure that they've actually got a legitimate license and do the notarized checks if it's in a foreign language. Go to the regulatory authorities in that country to find out whether those licenses are valid and true. And also check that their business is established business, because sometimes you could start doing business with an organization that could go bust tomorrow and they wouldn't even tell you, and you would be sourcing a product and supplying it to someone when that organization's license has just been removed. So always do your checks and continue to do those checks on a regular basis. So how do I look after my product in the supply chain? Know the packaging, know the labeling, know your product stability, know exactly what condition the product should be stored in and transported in. Some products are very fragile. They can get damaged during transportation. So how are you packaging it? Are you packaging it securely? Is it temperature sensitive? Are you using thermal boxes to ship your product? Are you putting temperature loggers to check that you know the temperature of the product right up till the point at which the customer receives it? If the product does experience temperature excursions, then do you have stability data for that product to have a look to see whether the product is still safe for the patient to use, even if the temperature had gone out slightly? Understand the premises in which you're storing your product. Is it fit for purpose? Risk assess your supply chain, your storage facility against the EU GDP guidelines or even the World Health Organization's GDP guidelines. Do your gap assessment. Focus on the areas of great concern. Do your risk assessments and see where areas need to be improved. And continually reevaluate that process that you have in place using your QMS system and make continual improvements. I've got a slide here that very briefly goes over some of the areas of control that need to be in place within a warehouse facility. During the one-day training course, we'll go into more detail on these and give you some real examples of where things again could go wrong if you didn't have some of these processes proceduralized and corrective and preventative maintenance systems in place to ensure that these issues are resolved and improved on a continual basis. Before I do any risk assessment, even at the beginning of an organization being set up, I would like to perform a gap assessment. So the gap assessment will discover where are the significant gaps, and it will highlight what areas need to be prioritized. And this is achieved by doing a risk assessment, by identifying what are the risks, assessing them, and then putting processes in place to mitigate those risks. So identify the risk, assess that risk, and put things in place to correct that. You have to apply risk assessment in your supply chain. Procedures need to be there to describe how you go about doing your risk management. And it's not one person doing the risk management, it's a team. It could be a team within your organization, or it could go even further. You could involve your transportation carrier, your third-party warehouse that you're using, your suppliers in your supply chain. You really need to involve all of them really to have a very thorough and well-assessed risk assessment in place. The GDP guidelines also, from a regulatory perspective, is a good document to use as something that will check whether you're going in the right path in terms of the things that you will be focusing on in your risk assessment. And focus, if you have a lot of issues, focus on those that are more likely to have an impact on the end user, the patient. And risk assessment is an ongoing process. You don't do it once and leave it. You got to continually perform your risk assessments to bring down the level of risk within your supply chain. And if you need more reading around this topic, the ICH Q9 is a great document. During the one-day training course, we go through a couple of scenarios, and one which we will be touching on in the training is around transportation. And there's a lot of that going on around the world now, with the pharmaceutical industry being so spread across the globe. And I pick an example of transportation to do a risk assessment on, and apply the standards to ensure that the risks within the supply chain are reduced. And it's a great assessment where we work in groups online to try and find the way to mitigate the risk within the supply chain. And we go through a scenario together in the training. With gaps discovered and prioritized, the first step really is to involve key personnel and any third party that's involved in that supply chain that's being risk assessed. Using the local GDP guidelines, perform a gap assessment. When doing the gap assessment initially, identify what are the critical issues, what are the average concerns and the very low concerns in your gap assessment. Then from the gap assessment, then prioritize what would be looked at as part of your risk assessment. Select a risk assessment tool that works well for you. I tend to use the failure mode effect analysis, which is very commonly used within the pharmaceutical industry. And it's one that's used in this example during the GDP training session. And you identify what are the corrective and preventative measures that come out from your risk assessment. Prioritize the actions and reevaluate them on an ongoing basis, typically on an annual, every 12-month basis, to see if the risk level has been reduced further. And finally, in the one-day training course, we look at the support mechanisms that help us to ensure that we keep bringing down that level of risk within our supply chain. We look at the training systems that need to be in place, the internal and external audit process that should be there and challenged on an ongoing basis. The communication systems within the organization. Management review is one example of that. And how do we do management review, and what are the things we need to consider in those as a minimum? And getting that involvement from the senior leadership, getting their endorsement to find ways to continually improve the business, not from a level of just a quality system, but even beyond that in terms of our supply chain and our partners that we work with, to find ways to improve the way we offer our service and ensure the quality and safety of medicines in our supply chain. So just to summarize what we'll be covering in the one-day training course. What does GDP mean to us? It's a supply chain, the product, regulations, and the quality risk management. What do the regulators say and what do they actually want? They ask a lot, but do they really need all of it? The commonalities between the countries. The World Health Organization's document on good distribution practice is fantastic. It covers a lot of the requirements that are also seen in the EU good distribution practice guidelines. And how should I look after the product in my supply chain? Know the product, know my processes, and also have that knowledge in the background of what the regulations are expecting from a local level and also from a global perspective. Being assured that my product and the patient are safe, the risk assessment tool is a great way to achieve that. And it saves a lot of time and money for the business, ultimately. And we continually maintain this through the systems that we put in place, through our training, our audits, the communication within the organization to raise the awareness, and that continual improvement systems that we have to make our businesses more efficient and more compliant. Thank you for listening to this short overview of our one-day Global Good Distribution Practice training course. If you'd like to attend the course, then please contact us at info@inglasia.com. If you come to our website, www.inglasia.com, you could find out some more information on this course. Thank you very much